The Arctic is a land where survival is an ongoing battle, a frozen world that challenges the very essence of life. It stretches infinitely, a vast, cold expanse, with towering glaciers and jagged icebergs that carve through the landscape like sharp knives. The sun hardly pierces through the gray clouds, casting an eerie, pale light over the tundra. In this frigid environment, every living being is forced to adapt or perish. The snow here is never still. It dances with the wind in a chaotic, swirling mass of frozen crystals. Each gust of wind carries a biting cold that slices through even the thickest of furs. The ground beneath is a patchwork of ice, snow, and deep crevasses where danger lurks at every corner. There's no mercy in this world, only the strong and the resilient survive, and for the weak, it's a relentless fight against death. In the midst of this harsh wilderness, a lone polar bear cub struggles to stay alive. Its small, fragile body is nearly covered by a blanket of snow, with only its weary, shivering form visible. The cub's fur, once thick and pure white, is now matted and weighed down by frost. Its eyes, wide and filled with fear, reflect the desperation of a creature on the brink of extinction. The cub's story is one of survival against all odds. Alone, separated from its mother during a violent snowstorm, it has wandered across the barren land for what seems like an eternity. The blizzard came without warning, a cruel force of nature that scattered the cub's family into the vast expanse. The mother, who had been the cub's protector and guide, was lost to the storm, leaving the small, helpless creature to fend for itself. Now, the cub finds itself on a rapidly melting ice patch, its only refuge shrinking with every passing hour. The warmth it so desperately craves is but a distant memory, its body cold and stiff from the biting chill. Weak and starving, it tries to move, but every step is a struggle. It searches desperately for food, for anything that might sustain it, but the Arctic is unforgiving. Nothing is abundant here, food is scarce, and the cub's frail form can barely keep up with the demanding environment. As it stumbles along, the cub's breathing becomes more labored, its small chest heaving as it fights to stay awake, to survive. The Arctic foxes that roam the area seem to sense the cub's vulnerability. They watch from the shadows, their bright eyes gleaming as they evaluate the situation. Though they are scavengers by nature, the cub is not their prey, yet. Every crack of ice, every distant howl of a predator, sends the cub into a state of heightened awareness. It knows that the longer it remains in this state of weakness, the greater the danger becomes. Yet, despite the cold and hunger, it keeps moving, driven by an innate desire to survive. How did the cub end up in this dire situation? What happened to its mother, and why is it so alone in this frozen wasteland? The answers remain a mystery, but there are subtle clues scattered across the ice. Faint tracks lead off into the distance, evidence of a frantic search, a mother who has been desperately looking for her lost cub. Yet, the tracks end abruptly, lost to the storm, and with them, any hope of a reunion. In its current state, the cub is little more than a helpless bundle of fur struggling to endure. Its chances of survival grow slimmer by the minute. But there is something pure in its innocence, something that resonates deeply with anyone who happens to see it. Despite the harsh conditions, there is still a glimmer of life within the cub's bright eyes, a spark of determination to keep fighting, no matter how bleak the world around it may seem. In this frozen wasteland, where hope is a fragile thing, the cub's journey is one of sheer will. It is a stark reminder of how fragile life is, especially in the face of such unrelenting adversity. Every movement, every breath is a defiant cry against the brutal forces of nature. But even in the face of overwhelming odds, the cub clings to life, driven by a force greater than itself, the primal instinct to survive. The storm rages on, its fury unabated, as a lone figure struggles against the Arctic's relentless wrath. This is not a place for the faint-hearted. Here, only the strongest and most resilient can endure. The wind howls, carrying with it a biting cold that seems to cut through every layer of clothing, every barrier between man and the savage land. But this figure presses on, unwavering, driven by a purpose that is deeply personal. Dr. Sarah Landon, a wildlife researcher, has spent years studying the Arctic's ecosystems, but today, she is not here to observe. Today, she is driven by a sense of urgency. her heart pounding as she trudges through the deep snow. The storm is fierce, its icy tendrils lashing at her face, but she moves forward, guided by something far stronger than reason, an instinct that tells her she is on the cusp of a discovery. The blizzard is a beast in itself, a force of nature that threatens to swallow her whole, but she has encountered worse in her time. A veteran of the Arctic's unforgiving clutches, she has learned to respect its power, to tread carefully in its icy embrace. Yet today, she feels a strange pull, an urgency she cannot explain. Something is out there, something that calls to her, beckons her forward. Her boots crunch in the snow as she continues her trek, the horizon an endless blur of white. Then, just as she is about to give in to exhaustion, she sees it, a small figure, barely visible against the vastness of the tundra. Her breath catches in her throat as she realizes what it is. A polar bear cub, shivering, weak, and alone, stranded in the middle of the wilderness with no hope of survival. For a moment, Dr. Landon hesitates. The cub looks so fragile, so helpless. The instinct to protect it is overwhelming, but she knows that this is a dangerous situation. The Arctic is unpredictable, and venturing too close to a bear, especially a cub, could be a death sentence. But as she studies the cub's weak form, something stirs inside her. She cannot leave it to die alone. With careful steps, Dr. Landon approaches the cub, her heart pounding in her chest. It does not run, does not try to flee. It simply sits there, too weak and cold to do anything but stare at her with frightened, yet trusting eyes. She reaches into her pack, pulling out a warm blanket and a small packet of food, offering it to the cub. It looks at her, then at the food, and finally, slowly, takes a hesitant step forward. As the cub reaches the food, Dr. Landon lets out a soft breath of relief. She knows she is taking a risk. The Arctic is a place where help is often too far away, and the cub's chances of survival are slim. But in this moment, she feels a bond forming, an unspoken connection between them, something that transcends species. It is a moment of shared vulnerability, a quiet understanding between two beings in a place where life is as fragile as the ice beneath their feet. But as she gently wraps the blanket around the cub, Dr. Landon is faced with a dilemma. Should she continue to help this cub, to nurse it back to health, or should she let nature take its course? The harsh truth of the Arctic is that nature often has no mercy, and interference can sometimes make things worse. Yet, in her heart, Dr. Landon knows that leaving the cub to die alone would be unbearable. She gently cradles the cub in her arms, feeling its small body shiver against her. There is something in the way it clings to her, something that tells her it understands she is offering something it has long been denied: safety, warmth, and the chance to survive. For the first time since she arrived, Dr. Landon feels a glimmer of hope, and in that moment, she knows she cannot turn back. In the days that follow, the Arctic continues to lash out with its fury, but within the small shelter that Dr. Landon has managed to create, the cub begins to show signs of life. Its fragile body still trembles from the cold, but it has started to trust the human who saved it. Every day, Dr. Landon offers the cub food, warmth, and gentle care. It is an exhausting process, nurturing a creature that has been so weakened by the elements, but the cub's progress, though slow, is undeniable. It is an odd companionship, one built on quiet moments and shared struggles. The cub is wary, its natural instincts telling it to be cautious, but it begins to seek Dr. Landon's presence. When she sits by the fire, it huddles close, as though the warmth from her body is all it has known. In the early days, the cub barely moved, too exhausted to even lift its head, but now, it pushes itself upright for longer periods. It is still weak, its small body frail, but there is a spark of something more: resilience, a will to survive. Each day, Dr. Landon faces her own battles. The storm refuses to let up, trapping them in their tiny shelter. Outside, the world is a blur of white, the blizzards relentless and unforgiving. Supplies are running low, and her body aches from the cold. Yet, she presses on, focusing on the cub. Her every action, every movement, is driven by a deep sense of responsibility, not just for the cub's survival but for the hope that, against all odds, this fragile creature might one day return to the wild. But the danger is not just from the elements. As the cub becomes stronger, its presence becomes more of a liability. The Arctic is a land of predators, and the cub, though protected in the shelter, is still vulnerable. The sounds of wolves in the distance grow louder each night, their howls echoing through the storm. The constant threat of predators is a reminder of how fragile life is here, where everything and everyone is at risk. One night, as the storm rages outside, the sound of howling is joined by something else, a growl, deep and menacing. Dr. Landon freezes, her heart racing. She knows that the wolves are nearby, but this growl is different. It is too deep, too powerful. She looks to the cub, its eyes wide with fear. The cub seems to sense the danger, its small body trembling. She grabs her rifle, though she knows that it might be no match for whatever is out there. Slowly, she moves toward the door, peeking outside. The snow is so thick that visibility is nearly non-existent, but she can hear the sound of something moving in the distance. The growls grow louder, and then, through the storm, she sees it, a pack of wolves circling the shelter, drawn by the scent of the cub. Her pulse quickens. The wolves are intelligent, and they have been known to work together to take down larger prey. Dr. Landon knows that if they get too close, she will have to fight them off, but she's not sure how long she can hold out against such a relentless force. She closes the door slowly, her breath shallow, and moves to the cub's side. The cub whimpers softly, its eyes wide with fear. Dr. Landon strokes its fur gently, trying to offer comfort, but she can feel her own anxiety rising. The wolves are circling, getting closer with every passing minute. She knows that time is running out. Desperation fills her heart as she looks around the small shelter. She has few options, and the situation is becoming dire. The cub is still too weak to move on its own, and without shelter, it will not survive. Yet, there is no way to stay hidden forever. Just as the tension reaches its peak, a sudden burst of sound cuts through the storm, a crack, followed by the roar of something much larger than any wolf. Dr. Landon turns, eyes wide, as a figure emerges from the storm, its massive shape moving with terrifying speed and grace. A polar bear. The mother. For a moment, time seems to stand still. The wolves, sensing the new threat, hesitate. The mother bear stands tall, her enormous frame towering over the wolves, her deep growls reverberating through the air. Her eyes, fierce and protective, scan the area, searching for her cub. The wolves, intimidated by the bear's sheer size and power, retreat, their hunger momentarily overridden by fear. The mother bear looks to Dr. Landon, her gaze sharp and calculating. Dr. Landon knows that she is no longer just protecting the cub from the elements, she is now a trespasser in the mother bear's world. The stakes have shifted. And yet, the mother does not attack. Instead, her attention turns to the cub, who has been watching her with wide, hopeful eyes. The cub stirs, its small form shaking with emotion, and then, to Dr. Landon's astonishment, the cub lets out a soft cry, a whimper of recognition. The mother bear's growls soften, her eyes locked on her cub. The air is thick with tension as the two polar bears gaze at each other. Slowly, cautiously, the cub begins to move, its small body still weak but determined. It takes a hesitant step toward its mother, then another. The bond between them, forged through instinct and love, pulls them together. Dr. Landon watches, a mixture of awe and sorrow filling her heart. She has spent days, weeks even, nurturing this cub, and now, in this moment, she knows that her job is done. The mother has come to claim her cub, and no human intervention can change that. She takes a step back, her heart heavy but at peace with the outcome. The cub reaches its mother, and the two polar bears nuzzle each other in a moment of quiet reunion. The storm howls around them, but in this small, fragile moment, the world seems to fade away. The mother bear turns to Dr. Landon one last time, her gaze filled with silent gratitude. There is no need for words, only the unspoken understanding that, in the end, nature will always find its way. The days that follow feel surreal. The storm still rages outside, but inside, something has shifted. The mother bear and her cub are no longer just survivors in the harsh Arctic wilderness, they are a testament to the extraordinary resilience of life. Dr. Landon watches from the small shelter as the cub grows stronger by the day. Its fur, once matted with frost and grime, begins to look healthier. Its eyes, which had once been clouded with pain, now sparkle with life. But even as the cub's health improves, Dr. Landon cannot shake the feeling of impending danger. The storm continues to batter the landscape, and the temperature continues to plummet. The shelter, though sturdy, is not a permanent solution. Outside, the Arctic waits, a vast and unforgiving wilderness where survival is always uncertain. And yet, despite the storm's fury, there is a sense of peace in the air. The cub, now beginning to walk on its own, follows its mother's lead. The mother bear stays close, but her gaze is always scanning the horizon, ever watchful for potential threats. It is clear that she is determined to keep her cub safe, no matter the cost. Dr. Landon watches them in silence, her heart heavy with conflicting emotions. She had thought, at first, that the cub would never survive. She had thought that the bond between them was a fleeting moment, one of desperation and survival. But as she watches the cub grow stronger, she begins to realize that this miracle was not just about the cub, it was about the bond they had formed, the trust that had been built between them in those difficult days. One evening, as the sun dips below the horizon, painting the snow with shades of gold and orange, the cub takes its first few steps toward the door of the shelter. The mother bear follows, but there is a cautiousness in her movement now. She watches her cub, then Dr. Landon, her gaze sharp, as if asking for permission to continue. The moment is one of quiet, unspoken understanding. Dr. Landon knows that it is time. Time for the cub to return to the wild, to be with its mother and face the challenges of survival on its own terms. She takes a deep breath, her heart heavy with the weight of her decision. It is one thing to save a life, but it is another to let it go. As the cub ventures outside, Dr. Landon stands at the threshold, watching. The world is still covered in a blanket of snow, the wind howling around them, but there is a sense of calm in the air now, a calm that comes with knowing that they have done all they could. The cub hesitates for a moment, then turns back to Dr. Landon. Its eyes meet hers, and in that brief moment, something passes between them, a silent promise, a bond that cannot be broken by distance or time. Dr. Landon steps back, her heart heavy with emotion but filled with an overwhelming sense of pride. She watches as the cub trots toward its mother, who is already moving toward the edge of the horizon. The two polar bears, now reunited, disappear into the storm, leaving behind only the faintest traces of their paw prints in the snow. And yet, as they vanish into the vast, unforgiving landscape, Dr. Landon is not left with a sense of loss. Instead, there is something else, a sense of peace, of having done something extraordinary. She had been a part of their journey, a small but crucial chapter in their story. She had witnessed a miracle, and in that moment, she knew that the world was still full of surprises, full of hope. As the wind howls louder, as the snow continues to fall, Dr. Landon stands alone in the shelter. But she is not truly alone. The memory of the cub, the bond they had shared, the courage they had both found in each other, stays with her. It is a reminder that, even in the harshest of conditions, there is always hope. That sometimes, miracles do happen, when you least expect them. As the storm rages on, Dr. Landon begins to pack up her things, knowing that the journey is far from over. There are more stories to tell, more lives to protect, and the Arctic is full of secrets still waiting to be discovered. But for now, there is a quiet peace that settles over her, a peace born of knowing that she had been part of something incredible. The miracle of survival, of love, and of the unbreakable bond between mother and cub, had been a gift she would carry with her forever. The days after the storm feel strangely still, as if the world itself is holding its breath. The air is crisp and cold, and yet, in the silence of the Arctic, there is a sense of anticipation. Dr. Landon stands at the edge of the shelter, her eyes scanning the horizon, but there is nothing, just an endless stretch of white, the jagged silhouette of ice and snow blending into the distant sky. The polar bear mother and her cub are out there somewhere, no longer her responsibility but a part of the wilderness she had come to understand so deeply. But even as Dr. Landon prepares to leave the shelter behind, something stirs within her. A sense of restlessness she cannot shake. Despite everything, despite the miracle she had witnessed, despite the knowledge that the cub was safe, there is an undeniable pull, a deep yearning to see them again, to ensure that they are truly okay. And so, against her better judgment, she decides to venture out, to track them, to see if the bond they shared could truly withstand the harshness of the Arctic. She gathers what little supplies she has left and steps into the bitter cold. The wind bites at her skin, the snow stinging her face, but she pushes forward, her determination driving her onward. She knows the risks: wolves, freezing temperatures, exhaustion, but she cannot shake the feeling that there is something left unfinished, something that needs to be seen to its end. For days, she follows the faint traces left behind by the mother and cub. The world is empty, vast, and unforgiving, but as she moves forward, she senses the subtle signs of life around her. The tracks of other animals, foxes, hares, and birds, are scattered across the snow, their small footprints barely visible against the backdrop of ice and snow. But these are not the tracks she is searching for. No, she is looking for something more specific, more important. It is on the third day of her search that she begins to hear it, the sound of something moving in the distance. At first, she thinks it is the wind, but then it grows louder, closer, unmistakable. It is the sound of heavy footsteps crunching in the snow, the low growl of something larger than the rest. Her heart races. She recognizes the sound instantly. It is the unmistakable presence of the mother polar bear. The wind howls as she pushes forward, her legs aching from the cold and the weight of the journey. The storm still rages, the snow blurring her vision, but she does not stop. She knows that she is getting closer. She can feel it in her bones. And then, through the swirling white, she sees them, a dark shape, massive and imposing, moving with a sense of power and grace. The mother bear. And beside her, the cub, now stronger and more agile than it had been before, moving with confidence at its mother's side. For a moment, Dr. Landon stands frozen, watching them. The mother bear's massive form is a shadow against the snow, but her eyes, those piercing, intelligent eyes, scan the area, locking onto Dr. Landon's figure in an instant. There is a stillness in the air, a moment of recognition. The cub, now growing in size, stands at its mother's side, watching the human who had once kept it safe. Dr. Landon's heart races as she takes a cautious step forward. The mother bear growls softly, a warning, but there is no malice in it. There is only the fierce protective instinct of a mother who has come to claim her cub. The cub, too, watches her with a mixture of curiosity and recognition, its eyes wide, though it remains close to its mother. For a moment, Dr. Landon feels a pang of fear, but it is quickly replaced by something else, a sense of awe, of wonder. This was the moment she had been hoping for, yet fearing all along. She had done her part. She had saved the cub. But now, it was time for her to step away, to let the world of the Arctic take over once more. The mother bear does not approach. Instead, she stays where she is, a few paces away, her gaze fixed on Dr. Landon. There is a silent understanding between them, a bond forged in the fires of survival. Dr. Landon knows that she is no longer needed here, that the cub will find its way, that the cycle of life will continue. Slowly, the mother bear turns, her massive form moving with quiet strength through the snow. The cub follows her, its movements still somewhat awkward but growing more assured with every step. They are moving toward the distant horizon, their silhouettes growing smaller and smaller as the snow swallows them up. And then, just as they are about to disappear into the wide expanse, the mother bear pauses, her head turning back to face Dr. Landon. For a moment, they lock eyes, a fleeting but powerful exchange. There is no need for words. The gratitude, the acknowledgement, is all there in that brief glance. It is a look of understanding, of respect. And then, without another sound, they disappear into the snow. Dr. Landon stands there, watching them fade into the distance, a heavy sense of peace settling in her chest. The wind howls around her, but in that moment, she feels no fear, no sadness, only a quiet, overwhelming sense of completion. The cub is safe, the mother has found her, and the cycle of life continues. She had witnessed a miracle of survival, of love, and of the unbreakable bond between mother and cub. As Dr. Landon turns to make her way back, the storm rages on, but she is no longer concerned with the weather, with the dangers that lie ahead. She knows that, sometimes, the greatest miracles happen when we let go. And sometimes, the most beautiful things are the ones that we set free. The storm that had raged for days finally began to subside, leaving behind a silence so profound it seemed to hold the entire world in its embrace. Dr. Landon stood at the threshold of the shelter, her gaze lingering on the vast, frozen expanse that stretched out before her. The tracks of the mother and cub were long gone, erased by the relentless winds and snowfall, but their memory remained etched in her heart. As she packed her gear for the journey back, her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. The cub's recovery had been nothing short of miraculous, a story of survival against all odds. She had given it warmth, food, and shelter when it had needed it most, but in the end, it was the bond between mother and cub that had truly saved them both. There was a peace in knowing that her role in their story was complete, but it was a bittersweet peace. For in that final glance between the mother bear and herself, Dr. Landon had understood something far deeper than survival. The Arctic was a place of harsh realities. It was unforgiving, relentless, and yet, it was also a place where life found a way to endure. It was a place where even the most fragile could survive, given the right circumstances. And it was here, in this frozen wasteland, that Dr. Landon had witnessed the greatest miracle of all, an act of love, of sacrifice, and of trust between a mother and her cub. As she set foot on the icy ground once more, Dr. Landon's thoughts drifted to the broader message of the experience. What had she learned from the bond between the cub and its mother? It wasn't just about survival. It was about something deeper, something more profound. It was about the way in which all life, no matter how small, was interconnected. The polar bear's struggle had been a mirror of the struggle of life itself. The world was fragile, and yet, it was filled with hope, if only we were willing to fight for it. She paused for a moment, her eyes cast upward toward the gray sky. The Arctic, with its frozen beauty and harshness, had taught her something she could never forget. The world was not just made up of ice and snow, it was made up of stories, stories of resilience, of love, and of survival. And sometimes, those stories were the most powerful force of all. As Dr. Landon walked away from the shelter, leaving behind the only home she had known during this journey, she felt a deep sense of gratitude. She had been a witness to something extraordinary, and it had changed her. It had reminded her of the importance of compassion, of the need to protect those who couldn't protect themselves, and of the way in which every act of kindness, no matter how small, could make a difference. With each step she took, the weight of the decision she had made began to settle more comfortably in her chest. The cub was no longer her responsibility. It had returned to its mother, where it belonged. And yet, in her heart, Dr. Landon knew that the bond they had shared would never truly disappear. It would live on in her memories, in the quiet understanding between human and animal, in the fleeting moments of trust that had been forged in the heart of the storm. She couldn't help but smile as she imagined the cub, now reunited with its mother, finding its way in the world. It would face new challenges, of course, but it would do so with the strength of its mother by its side. And perhaps, in some small way, it would carry a piece of her with it, just as she would carry a piece of it. And yet, even as Dr. Landon walked away, she knew that the journey was not truly over. There were more polar bears out there, more creatures struggling to survive, more lives that needed protection. The Arctic had many more stories to tell, and she would be there to listen. As she trudged through the snow, her heart lighter than it had been in days, Dr. Landon took one last look back. In the distance, she thought she saw a movement, a flicker of something white against the endless horizon. Perhaps it was the wind, or perhaps it was the polar bear family, still making their way across the frozen wilderness. She would never know for sure, but it didn't matter. The important thing was that they were out there, together, surviving as they had always done. The sun began to peek through the clouds, casting a soft, golden glow over the snow. The world seemed to come alive in that moment, as if nature itself were offering its quiet approval. And as Dr. Landon continued her journey, she couldn't help but feel that, despite all the hardship and all the loss, there was something worth fighting for, a beauty in the struggle, a miracle in the survival. With each step she took, she knew that the story she had witnessed, the story of the cub and its mother, was not just their story. It was a story for all of us. A story of hope, of love, and of the extraordinary power of life to endure, even in the most unforgiving of places. And so, as the winds began to die down, Dr. Landon's heart filled with quiet contentment. The polar bear cub had been saved, and the mother and cub were together again. But perhaps the greatest miracle of all was that, in that fleeting moment, the world had been reminded of its capacity for kindness, for survival, and for hope. As she walked away, Dr. Landon carried that hope with her, knowing that, in some small way, she had made the world a better place.